I'm going to adjust my presentation a little bit and to try and change the mood in the room. I know this is a serious topic, but I come from the privileged position of being a Western journalist former journalist working out of Australia. So we make decisions about how we handle violent images in news from what seems to be a very easy chair in comparison. So the topic is, as you know, how the media handles violent images and events, subtitled "When Less is More" in my case. So I asked the question, to what extent is the use of graphic material essential to producing memorable television news stories? To answer that, I decided to do a short survey among my colleagues at SBS. But before I share those results, I thought it might be fun, as it's the end of the day, to ask you to participate in that same short survey. So let's do something different. All I want you to do is to grab something to write with and to cast your mind back over your entire lifetime and think about what are the top 4 stories, news stories that come to mind, the most graphic, violent news stories, and the most memorable news stories you have. What are your top 4? And if you just jot them down in your if you think about what are the most graphic news stories you've seen in your life that you remember, what are the things that you retain? What are the top 4? Your top 4? They're different for everybody, and there's no right or wrong answer. It's a question of just thinking about all the news stories you've ever seen in your life, the ones that are graphic, the ones that cover violent images and events, perhaps, but the ones that you retain the most. What are the ones that you most retain? What are your top 4 stories that you think about over the course of your life? So just have a few minutes and think about what are the 4 stories you most remember seeing on the news. And I'll just get the rest of this ready here. Okay. So that's your survey question. So, have you done that? Are we ready to go? Okay, so to compare it with the survey sample that I did with my colleagues at SBS, we'll have a look at what that survey sample was. This is not an academic survey, I might add, so it has no merit on that ground. But the survey group was small. It was 4 men and 4 women. They were aged between 23 and 53. Importantly, they were not journalists or news producers. They were members of the general staff. They were, however, educated, media literate and screen savvy. So they were representative of the current audience and also the coming audience for television news. So let's have a look at the results. What did they choose? Oh, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. Okay, this is the first female, aged 31. She chose the images of the plane flying into the Twin Towers, a generic shot of soldiers from the First Gulf War. She remembered the 2004 terrorist attack on a train in Madrid. She said she particularly recalled the wreckage and confusion of that event. And finally, she chose the 2004, specifically 2004 tsunami from the images that we saw from the tourist resort in Thailand. Specifically, she thought of a woman hanging onto a tree, a point that I will come back to later. The second female was aged 43, so good, substantially different age group. She remembered particularly the people jumping from the Twin Towers. You might remember these shots. They were seen in the distance, but there was quite a few of them shown for the first bit of that coverage. She remembered the almost biblical images that Michael Buick captured of the Ethiopian famine in 1984. She remembered this couple down here, for those of you who don't know, it's the victory speech of the Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke in 1983. It was particularly a memorable event for the non-conservatives in Australia. He ended 8 years of Conservative rule, and there was much celebration on that point. And the final image she remembered, or she thought she remembered, was the head of the 9-year-old Japanese schoolboy impaled on his school fence in the town of Kobe. An older schoolboy had impaled his head on the fence. Interestingly, that image was never shown on television in Japan, but she was sure she had vividly recalled it. The third female, aged 35, again, her specific thing was she remembered the planes going into the building on 7/11. She remembered Saddam's statue being pulled down by the US soldiers in Baghdad in 2003. She recalled the Je suis Charlie protests, specifically when they are around the monument with their posters late at night. And finally, she happened to be working for the Defence Forces at the time, and she remembered what she found to be highly amusing mission accomplished speech of the then US President. The final female, I've done something here. I think I can do it. Here we go. Final female, again, the World Trade, the Twin Towers burning. She remembered the vision taken from the roof of the hotel in Sri Lanka as opposed to Thailand in the tsunami in 2004. The famous man in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. And of all things, the confusion around the shooting of the attempted assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981. So now let's look at the four men and see what we can see from them. First man, he was the youngest in the survey group. He's university-educated, a lawyer. He was 23. And these are what he remembers. He remembered the graphic images of September 11, particularly the second plane. He said, "I will always remember the second plane." It was interesting to me how they had a particular point at which they engaged with those images. He remembered Saddam being pulled down, and he remembered particularly the Jihadi John footage from that first came out over the ISIS beheadings. And because he was at university, I suspect at the time he rather liked the shoe being thrown at President George Bush in the press conference, so he remembered that. The second male remembered he had the most gruesome memories, actually, and so he remembered the beheading of the British soldier Lee Rigby on a London street in 2013. He particularly noted that the guy was ranting and the body was still on the road. He remembered the image of the 7-year-old Australian boy whose father was an ISIS jihadist who'd been taken to Syria by his father, and his father had taken photographs of him holding up the beheaded victim of an ISIS victim. And these images were, I don't know how they played out around the world, but they were particularly hauntingly received in Australia because these were Australian children who had been taken to Syria by their father and given beheaded heads to hold up, and that those images were taken and circulated on social media, and through that made their transition from social media into the broad, both print and television media. He also remembered the people jumping out of the Twin Towers. And finally, this image is best I could find. But this is a massacre, a very famous massacre in Australia at Port Arthur, where many people were killed by a single gunman, 35 people in fact. And interestingly, this site is an historic site in a very country rural setting, and so it was very odd that in this rural setting in Australia there was such violence, and he remembered the sound particularly of the gun, and that was the only audio memory that anyone actually referred to. The third person remembered a very famous speech. This is a key political moment in Australian history. This is the then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, during a moment of constitutional crisis when he'd been sacked by the Australian Governor-General in 1975. He remembered the Challenger disaster, watching the Challenger disaster, the Berlin Wall coming down, and Obama's victory speech in Chicago on the election night. He also remembered specifically the parents of Christy McAuliffe, who died in the Challenger disaster, watching as it happened. The final man remembered, he was slightly younger than me, and he remembered firstly the man on the moon, Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon in 1969. He remembered the Challenger disaster, again the Twin Towers, but his memory was different again. He remembered the buildings collapsing. He didn't remember the people, he didn't remember the planes specifically. The thing that he was most, he held most was the buildings collapsing. And finally, he remembered the Lindt Cafe hostage siege in Sydney. He particularly remembered the shots that were shown of the gunman inside the cafe. Now, although this was first run out around the world as being maybe another ISIS incident, it wasn't. This was just a crazy man who had gone through the legal system and pulled a number of media stunts. But for a few hours, it did traumatise the world, and people did lose their life as a result of that. So, what do we learn? If we pull all this together, what do we learn? We learn that out of all the stories recalled, 37.5% were terrorist-related stories. Interestingly, to my mind, the main political movements were the second biggest section. And often in television there's a compulsion not to show speeches. There's a compulsion towards vision. But actually, what is retained often are these moments where major speeches are delivered. I found that a bit surprising coming from a television background. Revolution and protest, so change, natural disaster, and science and generic war footage all were equal in fourth position. And finally, just murders and massacres that are not related to broader political events, but are just big incidences in a particular society. So I thought it might be interesting for us to just raise our hands around the room and see how the room cut up about that. So if you look at your list of 4, yes?
Actually, list of 5.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, the first thing that I remember was the story of this Palestinian boy living with his father, and he died. It was before the first Intifada, and it was all over the world, and I don't. Yes, not Alan, no, this was years ago. Mohammed al-Durra. Yes, I remember the picture. See, I forgot the name. And then the killing of Saddam. Then people going around Gaddafi, watching his body. And then the photos of Abu Ghraib, the prison. With the guys sitting like this, and this were the first that I remember. actually.
Yes, no, it's very interesting to see. Can I ask you which country you're from?
I'm from Egypt.
You're from
I should.
Egypt.
I
So
actually
it's-
ask
it's
everyone
very
to say
interesting
who's
to know, because I think location really affects your reception and what is important for you to retain. Oh, I've only got 5 minutes, so I just want to quickly do we'll do this instead, just by raising our hands in the room, because I think it might just give us a bit of an idea. So, how many people have got terrorist-related material on their list? So, just about a full sweep of the room. Of those terrorist-related material, how much of that is ISIS-related? How much of, so not too much actually. So, and how much of it is 7/11 related? 9/11, sorry, 9/11 related. Much more. I think that's quite interesting. So, how many natural disasters are there on your lists? Oh, not too many. Maybe that's an Australian thing, the natural disasters. We're a big continent, a bit prone to movement. What about science and discovery? Any of the moon landings, any of the rockets going up? So only a few. Challenger. What about revolution and protest? Political change, So in a sense, actually, that's the second biggest category. And in fact, what about political speeches? Victory speeches? No, but the point is, I asked the question about violence, and what the key point about, one of the key points about this is what is retained is not necessarily violence.
Was this question that you asked?
Yeah.
Here, the 4 men and the
Yeah.
4 women, but I just noticed that not every picture has
That's right.
things to do with violence.
That's right. So if I just move through to my conclusions, the conclusions were these. What were the technical outcomes? The images that people seemed to retain were not necessarily graphic. There was little blood or body parts shown, and I know that there's different countries decide to show more graphic or less graphic material in their news, but in the material that was retained in Australia were stuff that were very clean images. The images were generally in wide shot. They weren't actually in close up. There was a sort of limitation to the intrusion on the image. So the image gave rather an impression, and only one respondent had an audio memory. So in terms of image and memory, the Kobe incident with the impaling on the fence and some other incidents prove that the viewers actually fill in a lot of the detail. You don't actually need to provide a huge amount of detail because the viewer's imagination is quite capable of taking over. One of the things that happened also was that the material from television news now blurs often with people's memories from movies. So the woman clinging on the tree in the tsunami memory was actually a memory from a movie that had been transposed onto her television news memory. If I did an analysis on the ages of how old these people were when they retained their images, all of them retained an image from their early childhood, which I think is particularly important for us who are making decisions about the extent of material shown on our news services. Each of those people surveyed had a particularly strong memory involving some violence from the news in about the period of 6 to 9 when you took it back. So I think we do have some responsibility around remembering that is a powerful time in the development of people's consciousness. Geography, in this situation, 5 of the 32 recalled a national event, 4 of the 32 recalled a regional event, but the vast majority was about international events. I'm not sure whether that's because Australia's can be a bit boring, but I suspect that's probably a pretty common thing. So what are the conclusions? The conclusions are that people retain images about power rather than images about pure violence. And that's a really critical distinction. The images are not necessarily graphic, in detail, or particularly violent. And the vision which is most likely to be retained is generally symbolic. Key political speeches retain their appeal. What's the way forward? Too much graphic details of injuries and trauma is counterproductive. The balance, there's a balance. There need to be, You need to be relevant, but you also need to be show some restraint. Do more than show and tell and look for context and meaning. We all know that. And as stories develop, less is likely to be more. However, this is our problem. We are not doing it as well as these people. These people know how to produce barbaric images that are restrained, that direct our gaze, and that people remember. There was a British photojournalist who died called Hetherington, who used the same principles that IS have used, and who've used the same principles that can be drawn from that short survey I did, to create these sort of symbolic images. There are questions for us as people in the news media, because the question is, we can't go around creating artistic images that retain their appeal. These obviously are highly emotional images as well. There is a balance to be drawn here. So in conclusion, my conclusion, if I find it, is... Okay, so I've said... So in conclusion, I say the news audience is impressionable, and impressionable from a young age. In this era of renewed propaganda, how the news media handles and produces vision is a weighty public responsibility for all of us. Thank you.